Hello and welcome to this episode of FinTech Focus TV, brought to you by Harrington Starr, global leaders in financial technology recruitment. Head over to the Harrington Starr website today, where you'll be able to download our brand new documentary, The Era of Convergence, which charts the merger of traditional and decentralized finance. You'll also be able to see our new magazine, The Financial Technologist, with the top 1% Workplace Awards. Enjoy the show and we'll see you soon. Hello and welcome to another episode of FinTech Focus TV with me, Toby. Today I am absolutely delighted to welcome to the show someone who was introduced to me recently via email, and I've been following up on that and really excited to get into the reads of a very interesting business doing very interesting things in a very interesting way. So that means you've got an interesting show coming your way. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Nick Root from Intergiro. Nick, lovely to have you on the show. How are you?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
Excellent. I was just saying beforehand that it can't be often that people have mistaken Lisbon for Islington, but I made a bet with myself beforehand that you look like you're at the Business Design Centre in Islington, but you're actually out there in Portugal, right? How is everything out there at the moment?
In Lisbon, yeah, it's really nice actually. Pretty warm. It's about 28 degrees now.
Yeah.
And not quite as crazy as it was because there's not as many tourists here. It's been pretty nuts over the summer actually.
I'm always jealous. This is the second time this week where I've spoken to someone who's been surfing while we're sat here in jumpers and doing all that. So you've got something right. We'll come on to all of that in a minute, and the answer as to why Portugal and your view of the remote world. But before we do that, Nick, if you would give us a bit of an insight into yourself and the business, please.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I'm English. I'm from London, and I spent most of my career in banking. I worked at Lloyd's and L&G, so two of the oldest financial institutions in the world, and then I went a bit more entrepreneurial. Started this business with some colleagues or some of my network, and we've been working on this for the last 6 years now, I think. And the origin of the business, so the business is an EMI FinTech. We provide B2B services and B2B2C services via API. And the reason we created the business was back in 2015, we were all pretty hyped about the internet and the kind of models that were coming out of the internet. So, crypto, IoT, marketplaces, platforms, all the usual suspects. And we were trying to get those things live, and we couldn't, mainly because of the kind of services which were available. The banks, they didn't really want to work with us, and even if they did, they didn't have the technology. So we hatched a crazy plan to create our own bank. And in the end, it didn't turn out to be a bank, of course, because that's a huge amount of capital and years of effort. So we landed on an EMI that provides banking-like services to businesses.
That's a really interesting play, isn't it? Because I think that the sort of concept of pivoting has had a sort of dirty concept to it in tech for a little while. And I like the fact that actually what you've seen there is this journey. To me, the origin story is an interesting one here, because there's a frustration of taking an entrepreneurial journey from a pretty corporate background. So you start this entrepreneurial journey, you're trying to do something with pretty new technology. That new technology finds some stumbling grounds and difficulties and frustrations. From frustration comes innovation. From innovation comes an idea and saying we can do this differently. It's my kind of story, and it's the sort of thing I love hearing and talking to people about. Yeah. But I also then think, right, okay, the idea is, and you're not the first person again in the last couple of weeks who's spoken to me about the dream and the vision, which I think is so admirable, of people there who are saying, right, I want to go out there and build a bank and start this sort of thing off. I think it's incredible when to hear that sort of thing, and then to actually say, look, that's more difficult than particularly we anticipated. To then have the dexterity to say, right, but we can make it this. Tell us about, did that feel like a failure? Did that feel like pivot? Did that feel like actually the eureka moment? What was your process of thought around that?
Well, I mean, it actually was a bit easier than that. We looked at the amount of capital and the amount of work that was required even then, when things were changing, at least in the UK, even then, it was much easier than it had been to create a banking license. It was still a massive amount of work and a massive amount of money, and what it is we've got all these new problems in the world, right? Technology is driving all this change, and it's creating all these new opportunities, and they're over here, and they need access to the banking networks and the banking systems, and they need access to financial services, but that connection just wasn't happening. So what we created was a middleware, basically, where we work with many banks under the hood, and we present those services to clients in a cleaner and easier way. And more than that, we provide it all via API. So it allows engineers to build against. It allows this kind of codification of money, which I think is what's been missing in the last few years. So the process was a bit easier than that, but it was an iterative process for sure.
Yeah, and that iteration is so often the benchmark of good companies, isn't it? Because sometimes people get so entrenched in this is the plan and this is what it's got to be, that actually they've sort of missed that element of iterative improvement to create the solution which they need to do. And I love, going back to that sort of thing. I think that 2015 and 16, it's at the early stages of that crypto IoT wave, and that's obviously so prevalent at the moment. So going back a stage before a problem came apparent and the solution came to there, what wrenched you away from the corporate world and threw you into that sort of wacky world of new tech?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and I don't want to knock on the corporate world at all. That was an amazing training and education for me, but it just wasn't for me. I was always a misfit. I was always trying to create new things. I was actually an accountant, and I was always trying to do accounting with code and stuff, and everyone just thought I was absolutely loopy. So I was always trying to find creative solutions to these interesting problems and work on these new things, and it was just clear that I wasn't a good fit in that environment. So it was clear that when I got to kind of 30 years old, I'd had my training, I had a good base of knowledge. I knew how banks worked pretty deeply, actually. I was a banks analyst. So I used to analyze all the balance sheets and everything for investors. So I kind of had that knowledge, and then I wanted to go and build things. I wanted to go and create new things. So it was a pretty easy move for me.
Love it. And you, at that sort of stage, to make that easy move into that sort of IoT crypto world, what was the attraction there? Because I remember speaking to people from institutions at that stage which said this is just money laundering and it's going to take ages for that to sort of really take off. What was it that gave you that comfort around that as an area?
Oh, what you mean, the crypto world?
Absolutely.
Specifically?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So I read Satoshi's paper. I remember, I think about 2009 or 2010. So way before all this, and it just blew me away. It absolutely blew me away. I was kind of drawing. I remember drawing Merkle trees on the board and one-way hashes, and thinking that this is just going to change the world. But then that was very, very early, and I had no clue really that it would take on like it did. I just thought it was a really neat idea, and it took a few years. This is now 5 years after I read the paper, until I was convinced that it was gonna, the internet needs a currency, right? It's pretty crazy that money's not an internet protocol, and it's so restrictive. So my view was that it was going to change the world, and it was interesting, and it was moving quickly, and it was very technology driven. So I wanted to be a part of it. I wasn't in the end, but I was just looking at it, and I was very interested in it.
And came into it. No, absolutely. Well, I think that passion follows or your interest and then passion are great starting points for where people want to move, and then it sort of goes from there on the entrepreneurial journey. So we're there, and we've got the idea of saying, right, here's a problem, we can start a business, and you and your network and such like decide, right, this is something which we can get behind. You're on that passionate sort of growth journey at that sort of stage. Now, you mentioned there about, we've highlighted it before, about being a remote business and a remote first business. You said before we came on air that sort of stage in 2017, it definitely wasn't as trendy as it was now. And it's really interesting for me that it is, it is super trendy at the moment, if that's what we're going to badge it as. I want to go through that and say, why first and foremost, why was that something that was important for you to do? And the second thing that I'm really interested in is I think there's a lot of companies that have done it because of the pandemic and have done it through necessity. And I think at certain stages, which we're seeing already, there's pressure to then move back to normality. And I think there'll be businesses there that miss the opportunity to do what you've achieved because of reconforming to the norm. And they might be a little bit more hybrid, but the ability to access talent might not necessarily be there because it's more difficult. I can't imagine for a second it's easier to have people all over Europe than it is to have them all in a room, and to be able to manage them through that sort of focus. So I'd love to learn some of the lessons that you've taken from that. But first and foremost, tell me the why. Why was that the case for you guys?
Yeah, and I'll just add that it wasn't only not trendy; it was thought of as pretty crazy actually.
Yeah.
Back then, so even more than that. But for us, it was really just because it was very practical. We didn't have any money really, right? And so we couldn't compete in Stockholm or London for bankers and lawyers and engineers, right? We didn't have the brand, we didn't have the narrative, we didn't have the money, and so the only thing we could we created an environment of a high trust environment where you can work anywhere when you want, pretty much, and appeal to what we called corporate quitters. So the lawyers who'd had a kid and they didn't want to work absolutely crazy hours, or the bankers that had been in London all their life and wanted to live in the sun or whatever. We created this environment where we could capture this top talent at a fraction of the cost because we could offer them more in the working environment. We're in the knowledge economy, right? So we need top talent. We can't just have mediocre. So early on, it was just out of that need, and it worked pretty well. We had some hiccups and stuff. Tooling needed improvement. Actually, very early on, we worked with an outsourcing partner, tech, and they actually taught us quite a lot because they were very used to presenting ideas and technology remotely and running the teams remotely, right? They'd often have a product manager in Europe or whatever, and they were East in Europe. So they were very used to video calls, recording minutes, using Kanban and things like that. Everything that everyone knows well now. That wasn't very well known then, and they really helped us to learn how to run the business like that.
What were some of the things that they taught you to do that? What were the keys? Because I always think about this, that I've been an office worker for 25 years, and the old Drucker quote of culture eating strategy for breakfast is always my concern when you think about remote first businesses, and yet I've seen people absolutely thrive on it recently, and it's completely rechanging my thinking about what that looks like.
Yeah.
But I still think it's a complication that people worry about building a business which is so sporadic and so independent and so individual, about how you create that culture from it. So I'm just interested about some of the lessons that you give from what you learned from them and what you pass on to people who are thinking about it or scaling that way as well.
Yeah. So what we learned from them particularly was very practical. Everything is a card, right? Everything is a project. And those projects can have various levels. You can have key ones and regular ones or whatever, but there's nothing that's being worked on that's not a card on a Kanban wall. That's the first thing, right? And then everything is easier to track. You can capture all the documents within that. You can follow the progress of where it is. You can see when it's not moving, and you can basically see at any one moment where the business is on all the projects. So that was a huge thing. It's very practical. But that's how they run their outsourcing business, and that's how most engineers work anyway. And so we kind of transmuted that across the business. So now, even legal or risk compliance or marketing projects, they all have a card, and they all work through the same kind of project management workflow. So I think you have to have that. Otherwise, you can't see what's going on. But there's so much more cultural, deeper things. And you alluded to this earlier when you asked about how lots of businesses are now doing it like this after pandemic, but they're not really committing to it. They're really just running the business how they always ran it in the office, but now they're running it on video calls.
Mm.
And I do think that's probably won't work. I think the businesses will either just revert back to the office approach, or they're going to have to fundamentally change how they work. So first of all, there's a trust aspect here, right? So you get a lot of questions when you are remote, like how can you trust everyone? How can you trust they're working? And so the obvious question from that is, why are you recruiting people you can't trust? And so one thing is the recruitment. So we went through a lot of iterations of recruitment. We have a very particular way of doing it, and that took us a while to get right. And I would say remote is not for everyone, right? There are certain kinds of mindsets and individuals that really struggle with remote, mainly because they like to be told what to do in more exacting ways. They struggle with that much chat. I mean, you do a lot of threads, death by threads. So there's a lot of 1-line, 2-line chats and less voice. I think that easily overwhelms as well. So I think recruiting is one thing, and the trust that you have in those people that you recruit. There's a cultural thing you have to do as well. It's very easy to die in threads, right? I mean, you can have a bad thread just like you can have a bad meeting. We have rules around threads and how to use those and when to close those off. Meetings is another thing. You very quickly just end up with a full calendar of meetings, and everyone complains about that, and that they're not actually working on anything. They're just in continuous meetings. So we have very strict meeting rules. Like every meeting has got minutes and actions always documented in notes on the Jira. Attendees, it's like, have the least amount of people in the meeting you can and have the shortest meeting you can, basically. So, there's a few things there, and they're not easy. You have to go through, like you said, iteration and work out what works well in your model. In our model, it's a very technical model. The business that we're in is highly regulated and there's risks everywhere. And so there's lots of lawyers and compliance people that are working very closely with engineers on really rinky-dinky low-level things. So the challenge that we had was, how do you get people to communicate well when English might not be their first language? They're all on video call and threads, and they're talking about really, really low-level kind of legal stuff. And so we ended up using much more visualization, much more diagramming, and that really helped us to help everyone communicate more effectively.
I think this is fascinating. It really is, because it's got the benefit of experience over something that not a lot of people have experience of. We've had it thrust upon them, and then seeing the opportunities. And I'm speaking to companies who scaled during the pandemic from a remote basis and scaled to that sort of thing, and now they're starting to feel like I think probably the teething problems, same things that you've been through.
Yeah.
So I think this is so important for people to be able to share and look at it and take those lessons that you've given there to make it make it something that can be successful. And clearly you guys are doing that, because it's working brilliantly for you. 200 other people now, is that right?
Yeah, so attrition's pretty low. We've got 180 people, I think, right now. So just under 200. It's working well, but then who knows, as you get larger and larger and larger. I'm not gonna pretend that we've got all the answers, and I'm not gonna pretend that we've got it completely nailed. But what I would say is it's worth trying, because just macro, we're in a bit of a crisis right now. Productivity is low, capital is sloshing around in businesses and not making much return. And there's an ethical aspect as well. I think it's a more ethical model because it gives individuals the opportunity to get rated and reviewed on the quality of their work, rather than what they wear or how they look or how they talk. And I think that is fundamentally better way of working and more of a meritocracy, because that's another thing as well. When you're remote, all anyone really sees is your output. They don't see how much chat you've got around the water machine or at dinner or at lunch or whatever. That all that kind of data is not there. All they really have to see is the quality of your analysis and your work and your output. Is a cleaner model. And ironically, one of the questions I have is, how do you know if anyone's not performing? Well, I would say it's easier in a remote model because all you see is their output and the quality of their output. Whereas if you're in an office, people can be very good at hiding and pretending they're working and looking very busy and chatting with lots of people. But actually, when you get down to it, they're not really producing much valuable output. So
there's a lot to be
that's an
said for
interesting
that, isn't
aspect as
there?
well.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a lot of corporate hiders, aren't there, in businesses, and I think this is an interesting thing to say. Look,
Experts, I would say.
Let's judge on the performance. So I think that's brilliant, and I know that you know, going back to the story, and this is so often the key to successful businesses that I'm speaking to, is the ethos and their mentality has been to make it easy. To make things as easy as possible for your customers to be able to work with you, to take complex problems and make them as simple as possible. So tell us about how you set up. You already said you're not a bank and you've moved into, you know, to you know, that different space. Tell us about that, you know, how you're set up and how that's working for you.
Yeah, so I mean, we have two platforms under the hood. So we what we noticed was that through, you know, the 2010s, there was this massive unbundling of services that were traditionally in one area, right? So you would, you know, in the 90s, if you needed a card payment online, a PSP, you'd use your bank, and you'd use them for FX as well. You'd use them for lending. You'd use them for transactions. You know, you'd use them for pretty much everything. And then through like the next kind of 10 years or so, up until, you know, recently 2020, I would say, those things all got pulled apart, unbundled, right? So PSPs were over here, acquirers were over here, then you've got the FX providers, the TransferWises, all the Revoluts, and you've got the business banking providers that are providing the accounts, and the lending services as well. And that was good because it showed you the quality that each of those could reach, right? There was a lot of focus there, and all of those individual things became much higher quality, but it presented a new problem, and that was that, you know, all these things were all over the place. So you had to have many providers, and it was a lot of fatigue managing all the contracts and all the legals and all the fees and all the interfaces and all the logins and everything. And then what we noticed on top of that was with automation. So as everything's becoming more automated, this becomes more of a problem, right? Because engineers are having to stitch up PSP with the banking provider, with the FX provider, with the anti-fraud provider, blah, blah, blah. And they were working very hard and creating quite a lot of fragility in the system. So we had the idea to bundle up all these things again in a fairly traditional model. You know, that's been working for the banks for many years, but with the quality and the UI and the UX and the experience that we'd learned is available. So we are an acquirer, which is quite untrendy nowadays. So we're principal member of Visa, MasterCard, right? And so we can acquire with them. So we can handle the card transaction and take all the risk on that transaction. We can issue cards with them as well. We can offer the bank accounts, multi-currency bank accounts in our name under our SWIFT BIC, and we can offer the FX services as well. And we do all of that through one API, actually two APIs, because we have one for B2B and one for B2B2C. So those they go to market through those two platforms. And so the hope is that that's not only more convenient for the users and the builders, the innovators, which is what we're creating this for, but it actually enables totally new experiences. So even now, like, we're pretty young still, we've enabled 2 or 3 models which couldn't have existed without us. So we can do closed loop transactions and interesting things like that. So that's what it is. I mean, at its very simplest, you can just have a bank account online that you can control with code, or you can log in and use it traditionally if you want. But it's much more than that. You can do FX, you can integrate it with your own system. You can even issue cards to your clients or accounts and create products with money in them, which I think is really interesting.
I love this, and all the way through this. I mean, you've used the word trendy a couple of times, or untrendy, in the course of the conversation. And to me, that's the epitome of entrepreneurial endeavor. Innovation in this sector is about looking at things in a very, very conservative traditional sector, financial services. The real companies that I think are doing exciting ones are the ones that are saying, well, how can we do this better? How can we do this, more interesting? How can we make it easier? How can we lose all the friction in the system to do that? And that goes all the way back to Satoshi and everything you're saying at the start, isn't it? It's about, let's make it something that is much more user friendly and user orientated, which for decades, for generations, banking just hasn't been. And I think it's really, really exciting to see and hear the way that you're looking at every single aspect of your business and saying, how can we do something and think differently and take that all the way forward? So I think it's really exciting. Look, I want to move on to the future a little bit. Tell me about the vision, and this is going to be exciting, I think, because if we've heard everything so far as iterative and innovative, then I'm pretty sure that we're going to hear some exciting stuff coming in this part as well. So tell me about what the end vision for the business looks like.
Well, the vision all along was that automation is coming to finance, right? And that's just going back to first principles. Businesses will try to be as efficient as they can, and they're going to try to offer the best services they can. And so they're going to try to automate. And so I think we are, the traditional view of business banking, and this was, like when I worked in the area as well when I was in London, was that, it's an interface, it's an app, you log in and you move money around, you create invoices, you run your payroll, and you operate it like that. I don't think that's how that will always be. I think that whole process will be automated. So code will control your bank accounts, and your bank accounts will get controlled from other interfaces and other systems. And that will fundamentally mean that you can make more transactions, you can save so much money, and create completely new experiences as well. I mean, if you're a crypto exchange, or you're a PISP from open banking, or you're a PSP, you're probably, even now, you're probably not manually making your transactions or your payouts to your clients, right? If you are, you're probably wasting lots of hours on that. You should really be doing that with some code. And so I think it's very exciting that now we're saying that these businesses can trade with the world with Python script, right? And more than that, a code is universal, right? A code can conceive or can do any logic, and therefore, once money is available through the code, I think you're going to see all these new models and kind of new implementations. And I think it's a very exciting time.
It definitely is. It definitely is. I've had a sort of smile on my face all the way through everything you've been talking about, because I just love it. I love the entrepreneurialism of it. I love the problems you're solving. I love the benefit you're giving to the industry. I love just the thinking. It's a brilliant mindset to go in there and just iterate, improve, take bold steps, and do something which is cool in every single aspect of the business. So I've loved speaking to you today, Nick. I really appreciate your time on the show. Tell me two things. Who should be speaking to you? If people are watching out there at the moment, who are the right people to be reaching out to you at the moment? And on top of that, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to get in touch with me is probably LinkedIn. Just look me up. I think I'm /RootNick, which is my name in reverse, Nick Root. So that's the easiest place to find me. I'm pretty active on there. Also, the business is very active on there. That's probably our main platform that we talk to the world, and we put most of our material out on there. Who should be talking to me? Anyone that, what I just mentioned resonates with. So you need to automate your transactions. You've got a payment problem. You want to put money in your app, right? Or you want to create closed loop payment systems. We're the only provider out there right now in the BaaS space that is the acquirer and the issuer. So we can really create our own card scheme, which is really exciting and can create pretty interesting offerings. Who else? anyone that's interested in all this, I'll try and reply on LinkedIn.
Anyone who wants to work remotely, by the sounds of it as well, and
Anyone that
part of
wants
something
to work remotely, yeah, that's a good
and
shout.
wants to be part of something pretty special that you're building. It's I've loved this. It's been a great way to start my day. The only thing I can say is I'm enormously jealous of you being out there in 28 degree sunshine and being able to surf. So it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you, finding out more about the business, having you on the show. Thanks for sharing, and loads and loads of stuff there for people to take away and think about and think about their business and how they run it and what they can do to challenge norms and disrupt. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us today.
No worries, I've loved it.
Good man. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks
and we'll
for
see you
having me.
soon on another episode of FinTech Focus TV. Thanks for now.